Jamal Khan is Australia's managing partner of executive search firm AMROP Carmichael Fisher. He has helped appoint hundreds of executives globally. Let's listen in for his insights on building high-performing leadership teams around the world. Hey Jamal, welcome to the People Quotient podcast. Great to have you on.
Thanks, Rohit. It's great to be here. Appreciate you inviting me.
Of course. Now, there's a little bit of confusion that some of our audience will have because you sound British, but you live in Australia, and I'm Kiwi, and I don't know what I sound like. So perhaps maybe we could start off with, for contextual purposes, just you, your firm, but the broader element of this podcast, as always, is helping CEOs, leaders, and investors gain some insights from people around the world. And I thought it'd be a great way to learn from you. But before we get going, hand over to you for a quick intro.
Very good. Thank you, Rohit. And yes, good spot. So the English accent from Nottingham in the UK. Born a long time in the executive recruitment industry since 1998, originally trained as a lawyer doing corporate finance and commercial law. And I'm the managing partner now for AMROP, which is a global executive search and leadership assessment firm. We're just shy of 70 offices in about 50 countries. So I lead the Australian business offices in Melbourne and Sydney, and we recruit boards and C-suite executives for a range of different businesses, anything from government through to private equity, VC, multinationals, etc., commercial services as well. Very broad.
Given your firm a very global outreach. So my first question for you is, having had that international experience and obviously being part of an international firm, when you think about the marketplace today globally, when you think about supply of talent, because that's what really you're in helping build management teams. What are things that you're observing in today's global marketplace as it relates to people, talent, management teams, broadly speaking?
Yeah, great question. So I sit across various different practice groups, and we do regularly catch up with different AMROP firms from across the globe. And I also chair Asia Pac, so I have a good lens in terms of Asia particularly, but then because of the various practice groups, we chat regularly. So I think it's very interesting now. The trends are increasingly common across the globe with nuances. I remember when I first moved to Australia, it was very, very much a case that if you had no Australian experience, no one was interested in talking to you. And I think over the last decade or so, that's changed immensely. So actually, there's a recognition that in many markets, we were probably a decade behind in Australia. And now there are constant global trends. So there's talent shortages everywhere. There are skills gaps. That there's a big focus around sustainability for most organizations now, for obvious reasons. And I think the landscape for C-suite executives is challenging. It's the variety of different areas that a CEO and C-level execs across the board need to be across nowadays is way more complex than it used to be. There's data, there's analytics, there's technology, there's cybersecurity, sustainability, you name it. You have to be pretty knowledgeable in all of those areas to be a successful C-suite executive. And then added to that, a lot of businesses are globalizing. And so you've got cultural nuances to deal with. There's generational differences. There's all sorts of issues based on the context of the organization as well, where they're at. So it's a very, very interesting landscape now to succeed. You probably need a lot more skills than you used to.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, it's really interesting because I think what you're highlighting there is two things, right? One is that the globalization of the talent market, right? So there is you are now people. Doesn't matter where you are in the world, you're looking at talent across the planet, especially at that senior level. And so in some ways that must be helpful because your talent pool has gotten bigger than the local pool. And in some other ways, it's become tricky because what's expected of a CEO or a board chair or a board member has now gone up because of the variables that you just outlined. And so when you think about those two play out, are there natural places where you find companies leaning in more? Are they sort of saying, hey, look, we much rather have a international talent come in and fill the role sooner? People leaning more towards, we want to get all of those things that nuances that you just described like unless it's a really strong candidate that has capabilities in all those areas, where do you see people leaning in given that complex dynamic?
I think there's a couple of things. So the notice periods in Australia don't necessarily they don't align to the time it takes to hire someone. So often there is a lag, and in which case, depending on whether or not the recruitment was planned or not, that can often impact how quickly the chair or the CEO, if it's a CEO minus one appointment, looks to appoint the role. And that often impacts whether or not the company's prepared to look globally or locally. Added to that, I think there's a lot of political pressure on immigration. And whilst on the one hand, there's a talent shortage, there's political pressure to reduce immigration. And because of that, it's increasingly difficult to actually quickly get a visa. And there's no guarantee you'll get the visa. And it can take, we used to take 4 weeks, and it can take several months now. So that comes into a decision making for the organization as to what do they go global or not. Now, within Australia, we're one of the most talent short countries in the world, which makes it very, very challenging. For some searchers, there might only be 5 people in the country, but that regularly happens, is that if you don't appoint one of these 5 people, you need to go overseas, and then it's going to take you months.
Yeah.
Are organizations leaning one way or another? The speed is often a big factor because they can't afford to wait 12 months, 18 months to hire someone. It's a big challenge. The cost to the business of not having someone steer the ship can be immense. And so it's I think
that's a great point. Yeah, great point on the fact that what's the cost and what's the opportunity cost, right? Because the ROI trade-off that you're describing inherently in there, which is if an investor or CEO or the board is not appointing somebody, that seat being vacant or occupied by somebody who is not going to be there long term, if it's a confidential sort of movement, then I think there is a massive implication culturally, economically, and obviously a long-term enterprise value. So I could totally appreciate that dynamic playing through in a way that's not always helpful. So how do you solve the problem with the limited supply in Australia, as you said, of talent and this regulatory pressure? Where is the give?
And that's a great point. I think we never look to find someone who's 100% fit, because my view is if there's not at least 20% stretch, then the reality is, why would that person want to do that role? What's in it for them as well? It's got to be a two-way equation, hasn't it? So it becomes a challenge. Part of that is through questioning as to why certain traits are needed and certain skill sets are needed. And look, this comes particularly in play in the current climate, where in Australia particularly, there's a massive focus around gender diversity currently. And often if we're mandated for ASX requirements or for board requirements, etc., that there must be some sort of diverse hire, whether it's gender or something else. If that skill set just does not exist in the pool that we're targeting, there has to be some give, there has to be some compromise. And therefore we have to challenge to say, well, is that particular expertise really needed, or have you got enough in the room, but you're going to need therefore to be able to support this person and impart your knowledge and expertise on them because you're bringing them in for a particular reason. For instance, on the board at the moment, they all want people with AI and digital and tech, but there's globally only 5% of board members have got any tech experience. So you can't suddenly invent that with the board experience. So therefore you have to drop the board experience in favor of the technology experience and the digital and the AI and the cyber security, etc. And therefore the chair has to be prepared to support that person to ensure that they succeed. Otherwise, you're setting the person up to fail. And we've seen that happen on a number of occasions where the person's been brought in, they get paid a lot of money, and then they get left to it and they don't get the support that's needed to transition the person into the role effectively, whether it's a board role or a C-suite role. And you set them up to fail.
Yeah, that's such a good point, because the clarity around what are you solving for and what are your priorities sounds like the key focus of your engagement right at the beginning, at least, maybe perhaps throughout, because as the journey unfolds and more is revealed both by the organization, their needs, as well as the market, you probably are doing this constant reprioritization of like, okay, we set off with 5 points that we wanted to get, we're only getting 2 or 3. Which ones do you want to give up on, and which ones you want to lean in? And that constant iteration in some ways helpful, in some ways not helpful, because you probably want your clients to settle on one or two things so you can then dig deeper into the market and figure out where the talent sits. Is that a fair statement?
Completely, yeah. We run a very transparent process. A part of it is an exploratory process to say, look, these are the sorts of people we're talking to that are interested and are a fit. Of the three things, one of them's missing, but which one are you prepared to give? And if not, then there's an issue. We're constantly questioning, making sure there's alignment across different stakeholders. And that can be another issue. The chair wants one thing, the CEO says another, and there's other people in the room that they're not aware of each other's targets. And you need that sort of skill set because you need, I didn't realize that. So it's constant questioning and alignment, realignment, and education around this just doesn't exist for that price point, for instance, or with that skill set in the market. So are you prepared to go overseas and look? And increasingly, because of the visa issues I mentioned, it's, well, see if there's someone overseas, but with an Australia or New Zealand passport that can easily then be shipped back, and there's some sort of ties to Australia, because we're a long way away, as you know, from most other geographies.
Yes. One question that comes up, Jamal, is given what you just said, it sounds like there is the core technical part of your firm, right? Which is to get talent in, build a market, get the pool of talents coming in. But what it sounds like is there is more to it than that. That's the core of the job. But do you find yourself engaging with your clients on the strategy, on the growth strategy? Do you engage with them on simplistic word, when you think about your value add, where does it go beyond the recruiting part? Because that's the core. You've got to do that to be able to, get the job, do the job. That's where you get paid for. But feels like this is bigger than that.
Exactly. Yes. And look, that's probably why there's a lot of people within the search industry that have had previous careers and been successful GMs, CEOs, etc., in their own right, and they've got some market knowledge in sector contacts and networks. So the ability to find the people and to engage with them and understand is really important. But beyond that, it sounds cliched, and you've come from consulting, but you truly do need to build that trusted advisor relationship. So your client comes to you and the chair comes to you to often there's no one else to bounce ideas off and to act as a sounding board. So they'll say, oh, look, we're thinking about doing this. You've got a good knowledge of everyone else and what they're doing in the market, and we can't get that information. So they often tap into us for market intelligence. Obviously, we've got to be very, very careful around integrity, ethics, and confidentiality, and not sharing confidential information from one client to another. But we've got a good idea of what's going into the market. So they'll often sound boards. Right, strategically, do you think this is a good idea? What are you seeing in the market? What about the org structure? We've got this issue. We're globalizing. We don't really understand accountability and reporting lines and how we're going to see that. What have you seen in other organizations? What's worked? What hasn't? Pros and cons, etc. So we truly do become that leadership advisor around the structure of the organization, what works, what won't, what's going to work in our context. And you see constant themes and trends. If it's a startup, it's a one sort of type of person. If it's a turnaround, it's probably not dissimilar to the startup. But then if it's a BAU type role, we need a very different personality.
What you brought up is I was sort of reflecting on when I partner with your peers, obviously in the States and in other parts of the world, other firms. I think what I found incredibly helpful is that market intelligence, and it doesn't have to be a direct competitive. So as a private equity investor and operator, I'd be looking for people not necessarily in like for like, but in sometimes it'd be the type of industries, so B2B services, so categories rather than specific industries. Because as you said, you can't always get people who've done exactly the same thing. And sometimes you don't want that. You want people who've done something adjacent, who can bring a knowledge base that's like different and bring a new insight to the industry. And so I found the partnership with your peer group to be so powerful if utilized correctly. Because often there are people I know within my own peer group who would, bring on an executive search firm and they'll just get them a job done, which is great. You get the job done. But I think there is so much more to it that can be gained if you are, as somebody who wants to bring in an executive recruiting firm to help out. There's more to be had. And I think that's your counsel, that's where you find your value add beyond the focused area of expertise. Go way much more And that's where clients are leaning in on you.
Yeah,
more
it's
consistently.
beyond the transaction. It's more of a broader business advisor.
Yep. Where do you find yourself coaching your clients the most is my next question. Like beyond there's the strategy, there's obviously there's the prioritization. Are there areas as you look back on your career in Australia, where have you found yourself coaching and mentoring, if I use the word, whether it's boards or CEOs, to help them, unlock certain things that they wouldn't be seeing otherwise?
Yeah. So I ended up finding myself doing that a lot. And as a result of that, I actually underwent the Institute of Exec coaching course to try and give myself at least a certification around coaching and some rigor, because I often find myself speaking to chairs of boards or a CEO. It's often lonely at the top for them, and they have no one else that they can utilize to pick their brains on certain things. So it's often those two are the key people that will use me as a sounding board. And a good example, the other day, there was a chief people officer that was saying, we've got some issues we're globalizing, we're putting together business support functions. And I know that's not your area. However, what are your ideas around the structure? Because we've got matrix lines, dotted lines all over the place, and we're kind of trying to work out what's going to work best. How do we make people accountable? The execs just want their reports to just do the job, whereas you've got to look after them mental health, you need to look after the training, the development, etc., etc. So who's going to do that, and how do we get that structure to work? So that's a real life example of a conversation a couple of days ago. And often you'll get CEOs that one minute they're talking about their organization, and then over a period of time you do become that trusted person, and the next thing you're talking about they're asking you about their career and what they should do next, which can be challenging in terms of independence. It shows that they truly trust you, but they start asking you about board roles and what do you think I should do in this scenario, and do you think I should stay or do you think I should go? Yeah. So you end up as a personal coach to many of the stakeholders as well.
I can imagine how that can be, you can be too trusted of an advisor, and then you've got to walk backwards a bit saying, hey, maybe I'm conflicted because... And also the other piece of conflict is that you've got, going back to your original point about supply side constraints in the market. If you, and the market's not that big to begin with in terms of demand, but then you've now gotten to know a lot of people who would hire your services, but then you've got the supply side where, you've placed a CEO a couple of times and now you go, okay, we're getting to a point where, for lack of a better word, they're just sort of moving from one place to the other place because there's not that many people that are qualified. Does that also create a situation that's a bit complex for you, given the dynamic in the market? And how do you navigate that?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, no, for sure. That's it's a global phenomenon. Any executive search firm with strong integrity and ethics will refuse to headhunt from a client, or at least someone that they've done any work with for probably the last couple of years. And often that's a restraint that's put in writing that if you work with me, then we're off limits for a period of time. It could be 12, it could be 24 months. I know in some other geographies, it might just be a particular department because an organization is so huge that if you work with that department, then that department becomes off limits. And other organizations will say, well, if we do $1 million in revenue, then we're off limits, etc. So I think particularly in the Australian market being so small, there's only 26 million people. And as I said, for certain mandates we run, there's only 5 people that might be an appropriate fit. Yeah. It becomes a real issue. So it means in terms of choosing your search partner, you have to be very, very careful to select one that hasn't got off limits with all the companies you need to target. And I've had searches handed to me previously where another firm has won the search, and then they've come to me afterwards and said, oh, they didn't tell us all of the target firms we actually want to approach are off limits, and therefore can you target these 5 and they'll cover the rest of the market. But the likelihood is you'll find those people in their off limits clients. And often when a client mandates us and asks for a proposal, they'll ask, are there off limits? The savvy clients will say, well, hold on a minute, if you've got too much of a track record in a space and you've appointed all the best people in this industry and there's a list of 30 appointments in the last year, well, where are you actually going to get good people from? Because you've appointed all of them and they're all off limits now, unless you're actually double dipping and poaching. So the savvy clients will say, well, if you've done 1 or 2 searches in an area, you probably mapped it and know it well enough, but you haven't got too many off limits to stop you approaching the limited pool that we've got. So they'll say, okay, great, you've done 2 recent ones, but they're non-conflicting with us. We want you to do it rather than another firm that's got a super impressive list of 50, which those not in the know will say, "Oh, they're impressive," and the savvy ones are going, "Hold on a minute, where are you going to get the people from?" Well, it's a disincentive to be too big. So you've got to be wary of huge search firms that have literally work with everyone, because then there's no off limits. So you end up just being recycled, or they're double dipping. And we've known instances where competitors have been caught working with a client and then trying to swap the 2 heads between the 2 businesses, and they've been caught out, and they'll never get used again. To be a successful executive search firm, you can never grow beyond a certain size.
Yeah, it's a really interesting dynamic that the competition in the market and the size of the market and the availability of the talent pool, it creates a really unique dynamic that I probably underappreciated previously. And I think in some ways, my other question on that front is, does that also in some regards create more camaraderie? Like, so to your point, example, where some search firm cannot access certain talent pool and they'll come in, want to say, hey, look, can you attack this talent pool because we're conflicted? Does that create opportunities for partnership between different search firms, or is that not that common?
It could. You could probably argue it's collusion and might be against some sort of anti-competition laws, but it doesn't tend to happen, although there are friendships amongst different firms, and you might get a phone call to say, look, we can't run this one, so I've recommended you. And so we do occasionally help each other out in that sense, because we know we're conflicted. But it doesn't probably happen as often as it could, because the reality is you could technically collude to say, right, you target all of these clients, we'll target those, and then when we can't run the search, we'll refer you in, and vice versa, and between us we'll win all the work. And I think outside of our industry, Amcor got into trouble doing that with another packaging company. So you have to be very careful to enter into any sort of arrangements like that, realistically.
Got it. One thing that, given all of this experience that you are describing and articulating, I have to ask, like, where are the places where you find your clients make the biggest mistakes, the things that they could avoid would help them be more successful in attracting talent? If you were to think generally speaking, given the dynamics you just laid out, what are the things you wish did not happen that could have helped them?
I think one of the biggest things is alignment across all of the stakeholders. If we have, we're headhunting and dealing generally outside of the board space. If you think about a CEO, the majority of the time we speak to a CEO or a C-suite executive that we've approached and not actively looking for a role. And therefore, the organization that's targeted them needs a very, very compelling story and value proposition to attract someone that's not actively looking for a role. Why should we join you? So I think if that company really thinks hard about the value proposition to join them and has a very strong elevator pitch and some substance around that, there needs to be strong alignment. We'll often see candidates go for interview and say, oh, I'm not sure, I don't think the board's aligned, there's infighting amongst them, they don't really seem aligned around strategy. The CEO saying one thing, the other execs are all there because they want an exit in 3 years. I think it's the alignment across the group with a common message being articulated to the prospective candidates, that they go away and say, right, these guys are aligned. I think the organization seems to be strategically aligned so that I know what I'm there to do. Go in and do it, essentially. But I think the value proposition, not having that and not having the alignment, is where everything falls over. Because if you're not aligned, you can't agree on the right person for the role anyway.
Yeah, I think that's right. As you said,
exactly.
Having clarity on what are you solving for and having aligned clarity. So there's the individual clarity, but then am I also on the same page as the rest of the team as to who bring it? I think that's what you wish happened more frequently. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, it's that alignment. And often part of our role is to say, actually, we've spoken to all the key stakeholders. These are the differences. Before we go to market, you need to ensure that you're aligned. Which voice are we hearing and which one are we going to market with? Because at the end of the day, as a search business, we're an extension of that business. And our role is to not just protect the branding, and it's actually to enhance the branding and the market positioning to tell the right story in the market. And so if they're not internally aligned, it makes our job very, very difficult and impossible to attract the right person. And you only get one opportunity to do that. If you blow the first phone call, that's it. You've probably lost them.
Yep. Especially given your point about supply side constraints and the demand sort of outweighing that. And so they've got opportunities they can probably go entertain. And so you've got, it's essentially what you're saying, it's a seller's market more than a buyer's market, given the supply chain dynamics. And you get one shot.
Yeah, because you're headhunting as well. They're not actively looking. It's very different working with an active candidate who is looking for roles, who will sell themselves, versus companies that say, we're just going to grill them immediately. Well, hold on a minute. They're not engaged in the role and they're not looking. You need to actually sell the role and engage the person and get them excited about it. And so it's a subtle balance between doing that versus working out, is this person actually right for the role and what we want, versus selling the role and opportunity to them.
Yeah, no, that makes sense, Jamal. One last question for you as we wrap up. If you were to leave our listeners with a do and a don't, so the things that you may have just highlighted the do by saying, please do align. But what are the last words of advice or counsel that you would leave your prospective clients, people listening, people who are actually looking for a job? You can pick your favorite category that you say, hey, do this and please don't do this, because that'll make the world of, talent acquisition, recruiting, building high-performing teams so much better.
Do that. Or not do that.
Yeah. I think the old adage with me sticks. This is from a client perspective. Be very, very rigorous and thorough around the process. Don't try and rush it. I talked about pace, and often companies want, because of the gap between the notice periods and someone being available to start, is that companies will try and rush a process. So the biggest advice would be to hire slowly, do it properly, rigorously, thoroughly, get every data point possible, and don't rush that process, because my experience is every time you rush the process, you end up actually having a disaster and taking twice as long as if you'd have done it properly in the first place.
Yep.
From a candidate perspective, even if you've been headhunted and you feel like the company has got to sell to you, go in there and do your homework. Don't go into the meeting unprepared. Go through, if it's a listed business, go through the accounts, go through the annual report, know who all the board members are, who the chair is. Do as much DD as possible, going fully informed, because you're more likely then to wow the company that you're speaking to. And if you are interested, you're more likely to have a shot at progressing to the next step rather than going in blind. And we see that people that think, oh, well, I'm the best in the industry, and go in slightly arrogant. Yes, you've got to sell yourself still, even though you're there thinking it's the other way around. So that's probably the biggest tip, to make sure you're fully prepared, which sounds really basic. But when you've not been to an interview for 15 years because you're the CEO, well, you'll be surprised how ill-prepared people often are, and they don't really know how to behave in an interview, even though they probably do lots themselves. When they put it on the other shoe, it's a problem.
Yep. Yeah, I think to that point, what I just add to that is, I think part of it is also your preparation also helps you do your diligence. The more likely you're going to ask the questions you need to ask to understand if it's a good fit for you as well. So I think it goes both ways, and same thing applies for the talent. So I think it's really wise counsel. Jamal, thank you for taking the time. Excellent. This has been fun, short and brief, to the point. I appreciated it, and I really enjoyed the conversation.
I really enjoyed it too as well. I appreciate the time and inviting me in, and thanks again. Hopefully provide some useful insights for you and any listeners.
It's great. Thank you so much. Talk soon. Bye.
Thanks, Rohit. Take care. Bye.
Looking for more ideas on how to accelerate your business growth, hire amazing people, and improve your leadership potential? Check out our full-length episodes on the People Quotient podcast. Subscribe now.